Some of the names.
We'll give everyone just a second to connect to audio and then we'll get started.
I see Rob is on.
Oh shit, this is C.
Oh, hey, C.
It's Cumby. That's my real name. Sorry.
No, I didn't see you there for a second. My screen was rearranging. There's Alan. He's the descending from the sun there.
Ahoy.
Hello.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started today. I'm Jacqueline. I'm with the Battleship Missouri Memorial out here in Pearl Harbor. We're happy to have everyone for our first ever virtual Mojo event. This is an event we've been doing in person for the last 5 years. This is our first attempt at a virtual presentation, so thank you all for joining us. First, we want to just go over some quick housekeeping rules for the virtual event that we ask all to adhere to. Please make sure that you remain on mute throughout the presentation. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. We do ask that you submit all of your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to put questions in throughout the presentation so you don't forget, and we'll get to them as soon as it's done. Make sure that you have your computer set on speaker view until the Q&A portion. This will allow you to see a full screen of the actual presentation and all of the images we have to share with you today. And last, we want you just to grab a cup of coffee, sit back and enjoy. And I'll turn it over to our president and CEO, Mike Carr, to share some introductions for our speakers and a brief history of the Missouri.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining this. I'm speaking to you from the former damage control room here on the Battleship Missouri, which happens to be my office, very unique office, and I enjoy it very, very much. This is a special presentation for Battleship Missouri because, as many of you know, Operation Desert Storm was the last combat engagement that the Battleship Missouri ever participated in, and almost exactly 30 years ago. Actually, about 30 years ago, Battleship Missouri entered the Persian Gulf, and initially did a series of minesweeping operations. But then on January 17th, 1991, the Battleship Missouri fired her first Tomahawk missile in the direction of Baghdad, and eventually fired more than 28 missiles. On February 3rd, the Battleship Missouri fired her main guns in anger into the beaches of Kuwait for the first time since the Korean War. And eventually, when the ground war began, Battleship Missouri provided what was deemed to be covering fire for what they thought was going to be an amphibious assault on the beaches. But as all of you will recall, the Army and Schwarzkopf went around behind the Iraqi army, and the whole war ended fairly quickly. During that engagement, a Silkworm missile was actually fired at the Battleship Missouri from Kuwait, and one of our British partners, the HMS Gloucester, saw it and actually shot it down before it hit the Missouri. That was the first time that an anti-air missile had successfully engaged and destroyed an enemy missile during combat at sea. Another great story. So that was the last combat engagement the Battleship Missouri ever had. The last official job the Battleship Missouri ever had was in December of 1991 to be the centerpiece of the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the 80th anniversary of that is actually coming up at the end of this year. So lots of history, lots of stories. I love telling the stories, but I know that you're here to hear more about the effort to create a national memorial on the mall in honor of Operation Desert Storm. And for that, we have two speakers. Scott Stump is the founder, and for the past 11 years has served as the president and chief executive officer of the National Desert Storm War Memorial Association. And he will tell us more about the effort to get that done. Groundbreaking is anticipated in November of this year. Scott served as the United States Marine Corps in the infantry during Operation Desert Storm and was part of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. Skip Graffam is a partner and director of research at OLIN. OLIN is a landscape and urban design firm where he heads design and planning projects, as well as OLIN Labs, which is their research practice. He's done a number of award-winning jobs, and there's a long list. I will just mention a couple. They produced the winning entry for the 11th Bridge competition for Washington, D.C., and the landscape design for Valco Town Center, a mixed-use destination effort in Cupertino, and the comprehensive reimagining of the Alexandria waterfront in Virginia. So I'm sure that you want to hear from these gentlemen, not about them. So with that, I will turn it over to Skip. Skip, go ahead.
Mike, just as a point of order, I believe that Skip wants me to go first. I'm his.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Back. Okay.
No, thank you, Scott. You unmuted faster than I did. Thank you. Yes, that is that's how we're starting off. Thank you, Mike, very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting us, all of the folks at the USS Missouri Memorial Association. It really is an honor, and I can tell you that my time in country, one of the highlights, the first one being coming back with all my pieces intact. The other real highlight was being able to see the mighty Mo off the coast of Bahrain in the Arabian Gulf. And that was right about 30 years ago this month. And I can remember looking out there as a young guy. We still had a month before we were going to go home, but I remember looking at that ship and thinking about all the history that transpired on her, and that was her last hoorah, so to speak, and that we got to be a part of that. And it was just at that point a short 45 years removed from the surrender ceremony on the deck of the Missouri. It was really a fascinating memory that I will never forget. So thank you for the opportunity. And what I thought we would do is we're going to go back 30 years and we're going to talk a little bit about Desert Storm, and then we'll get into the memorial aspect. I get a lot of flack sometimes. People will tell me, well, Scott, 30 years, that's a long time ago. And I'm very quick to point out that I was really, really young then. I was only 12 and I was a drummer boy. So I'm not as old as many of the others, but let's go back 30 years. And on the first screen here, before we go back 30 years, sorry, Skip, I'm getting you messed up there. That's our board of directors. And I've got to brag on these folks a little bit. This is a group, there's just 8 of us. We're just average Americans. There's nobody, fancy. There's no lobbyists. We're just average Americans. All of us are veterans. The 2 in the middle that you'll see there, the lady, Jo Etter, and then next to her, Bill Kerrigan. They're veterans, however, they didn't even deploy. So they have a passion for this project. That's what it takes. And the only motive that we have as a group and individually is to get the job done. And this picture was actually taken on our building site 2 years ago at the site dedication ceremony on February, I guess it was 23rd or 25th in DC there. So as you can tell, we're in a fairly prestigious neighborhood there. And that makes Skip's job just a little bit harder to make sure that, that the design rises to the level of this wonderful location for this memorial. So let's go ahead and go back 30 years. August 2nd, 1990. And I know you all remember that day because that was the day that the gas went up from about 70 cents to $1.20, and we thought it was the end of the world. But something was happening on the other side of the world. 100,000 or so Iraqi forces crossed over the border into Kuwait, and within several hours, essentially owned that country. They controlled it. They started a rampage of murder, rape, pillage, destruction of their infrastructure, and it was the very beginning of a 7-month brutal and murderous occupation. It was horrific, and I know a lot of us had never even heard about Kuwait or even couldn't find it on a map before that. But all of this was unfolding. Then a few short days later, you'll probably remember the famous words that President Bush stated: "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." He came out very early, standing up for this wrong. I can remember people saying, "Oh, this is all about oil," and there may be some people still, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And I've heard subsequently that part of the motivation that the president had to intervene was an Amnesty International report that he read about the atrocities that these civilians were suffering, and he said, we have to do something. So this was just a few short days later. A few days after that, and he also started at that point to put into place the largest coalition of countries since World War II. We're talking 35 countries, including the US, from 5 continents. And this is the list of the countries. And I just want to point out, there are a couple of names on there. These are not typos. Egypt and Syria, they were on our side. But these folks all came together. And I think it's a real testimony for the job at hand and the crisis, how this really affected the globe. If we didn't make a stand at this point, who knows where it could have gone. So subsequently, on August 7th, Desert Shield started. And you can tell these are Army guys. They're just kind of slogging through there, got their weapons hanging. They would never let us do that. But anyhow, that's another story. But that was the first troops that actually got boots on the ground in Saudi Arabia. Elements of the 82nd Airborne are the very first that went in country. Now, many people have the misconception that Desert Shield was nothing more than the logistical and troop buildup for Desert Storm. That couldn't be any further from the truth. Desert Shield was a specific mission in and of itself, which was to shield not only Saudi Arabia, but the entire Arabian Peninsula. And the 82nd Airborne has the distinction of being the folks that stood in the gap and really, prevented and made the guy, Saddam Hussein, think twice about going any further than what he already did. So, people have called the 82nd the speed bump. Well, there's no way they could have stopped him. Hey, I know a lot of those guys. One of our board members, C. Freeman in Houston, he's an 82nd. I think they probably would have whipped him if they would have had to. My money would be on them. But Desert Shield was a very important, part of protecting the Arabian Peninsula, but also being able to build up. So these are the first troops, and you can see that was a very, very quick 5 days later. This troop deployment started. So I want you to think back to the climate in this country back in 1990. We're literally 15 years from the fall of Saigon. We're still thinking, oh my gosh, we still had kind of the Vietnam thought, boy, all of this tragedy that went on. Are we up for this? And you can see Time Magazine, really stated that. The media, there's a lot of uncertainty. Are we up for this? Are we capable of doing this? Saddam Hussein had deployed chemical weapons on his own people. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Are we going to go there and get wiped out by the chemicals? Who knows what was going to happen. The other thing is the conventional wisdom was, you have a country that basically is the 4th largest army. They just completed an 8-year war with Iran. They're battle hardened. and we're just a bunch of volunteers. There's no way that, what are we going to do? We're just a bunch of volunteers. We had never gone to war with an all-volunteer force. Okay, so all of that changed. A lot of the uncertainty changed on January 17th of 1991. It was the evening of the 16th here, but about 2 o'clock in the morning, the first planes deployed and started their sorties after the UN resolution was ignored to remove the troops from Kuwait. Saddam Hussein and the governing Ba'ath Party decided to ignore that, and Desert Storm, started. I can remember this personally. I can remember being in a fighting hole. It's extremely cold, about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I counted them. There was 93 F-15s, 16s, 18s. I mean, they were screaming over our heads, and it literally felt like you could reach up and touch them. That's how low they were flying. And at that point in time, we knew that there wasn't going to be a peaceful outcome to this. And contrary to all of the John Wayne-esque, we were kind of hoping for that, honestly, but it wasn't meant to be. This picture shows some of those initial aircraft, and it also shows the gentleman who orchestrated the entire air campaign, General Chuck Horner, just a wonderful gentleman. Sometimes he gets a little aggravated at me when I tell him about how he saved a lot of our skin, including probably myself. Just ran as near to perfect execution with this air campaign that anybody could have ever, even hoped to imagine. It was just run with such precision. And it was around the clock sorties. People sometimes in air refer to Desert Storm as the 100-hour war. Well, don't tell Chuck Horner that, because, we're talking about 40, depending on what numbers you're looking at, roughly 43 days of aerial bombardments, pretty much around the clock. This was a big deal, and there's a lot of armament and rounds that went downrange. Okay, and this leads to Storm and Norman and the left hook. And again, these two fit right together. The proficiency of the air campaign. I'm not going to say that it made things easier, but I think it made them less difficult. And this was the 100-hour portion, where the troops went in, and you heard reference before. Mike had mentioned the left hook. This was the left hook military maneuver, where the troops plunged in deep into Iraq and then came around and enveloped Kuwait. We were feigning all along, and I know a lot of people in the Marines were hoping for this, but that there was going to be an amphibious landing on the beaches in Kuwait City, and that's really what they thought was going to happen, and this completely caught them off guard. And we came around and just flanked them. Okay, and this you probably recognize too. This is what they call the highway of death. And this was the defining moment that led the president and the senior leadership to basically call an end to hostilities and have a ceasefire. Now, I do want to point out that history, this looks like a ton of carnage, but I do need to point out that they call it the highway of death, but a lot of those guys, these were all Iraqi troops who were hightailing it out of Kuwait City, trying to get up to Baghdad, loaded up with spoil and whatever they stole in these stolen vehicles. And many of these guys bail out of the vehicles and they ran for the hills. So there wasn't anybody in a lot of these vehicles. I'm not going to say nobody died, but it looks a lot worse than what the reality was. And of course, the darkest hour, for many reasons. Upon retreating, the Iraqi troops commenced to sabotage, and they lit on fire 700 oil wells. And let me tell you, clear day, and it would just look like it was going to be a huge thunderstorm. Hard to breathe. I mean, this was predicted to be, this was like environmental terrorism at its worst. Many folks predicted, the experts, it would take 10 years to put these wells out. And I don't know if you all remember this or not, but the last well was capped and put out in November of 1991. Remarkable work that was done, primarily from the folks there in Texas. And and a Canadian firm too that was really big into that. But this was something else. They also predicted that Kuwait City, the shoreline and the water would be permanently destroyed, and the outlying desert area. And the amazing story with this is 30 years later, it's basically regenerated, and there's really no signs of anything ever happening. So it really talks about the resiliency of Mother Nature for sure. But this was a real mess. And of course, the happy ending of this story, the liberation. This was all about liberation. You can see the jubilant look on these people's faces. I mean, this was 7 months, and that's what people forget. We look at our little piece, but these poor folks were living in, under this regime. These soldiers, many of them would even took over their homes. They lived in their homes and kicked them out. They got a reason to be happy. And if anybody doesn't think that this was a big deal, I'll put you in touch with a friend of mine, a young guy who he just turned 30 years old. He was born during this occupation. His name's Slayman El-Badr, and he works up at the embassy in Washington. And he has a distinction of having 2 birth certificates, one that says he was born in Iraq, the other says he was born in Kuwait. This was a big deal, folks. They had a lot of reasons to be happy. And so did we, by the way. So this really ends up, it was a huge and a pivotal event in world history, for sure, as well as our history. This, as you can probably tell, is the UN. Now, during the site selection process, which Skip is going to get into here in just a few minutes, we had a professor come in and testify before the Commission of Fine Arts. And I think he was from Southern Methodist University, but his words were, and I think they're so appropriate. He said this was the one and only time where the UN actually functioned the way it was intended to. It was remarkable. And you think of today's divisive world we live in, we can't even get 34, 35 senators to agree with one another. Can you imagine 35 countries, 5 different continents? It's remarkable. So on an international standpoint, this was huge. And of course, how it changed Americans. Some people just don't realize the lasting legacy of this. You see it right there, President Bush. Vietnam syndrome is gone. We were just coming out of this Vietnam hangover, as it was called. And there's a change in perception and a change in the relationship between the American public and the military. And not just the military, but those that served. And it's a legacy, folks, that continues to this very, very day. You hear the very frequently used term, thank you for your service. That was born of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, a legacy which continues. And I can tell you right now, nobody was giving up a first-class airline seat or buying you a beer in the airport in 1990. It just wasn't happening. This fundamentally changed the way that it happens. And I know a lot of people will see somebody with a hat on, thank you for your service. I mean, it really has changed the culture. And thank goodness that legacy continues on in this very day for the young men and women who serve in the armed forces. And of course, this was the Welcome Home Victory Parade on Constitution Avenue. Boy, I didn't get an invite for that. I guess I didn't have enough rank or wasn't in the right unit. But, this kind of says it all. I remember personally our unit, when we were coming back, everybody wanted to make a big fuss. They wanted to do the parades, and we were causing such a ruckus about it and causing such a fuss that our commanding officer, got us in formation, and he told us, this isn't for you. This is for the people. And we did it. And I didn't know what he meant by that until we were actually marching down the street, and then he made some remarks. And at the close of his remarks, he said, and I dedicate this parade to the Vietnam veterans who never got it. And that made it okay with us because we knew that it served a bigger purpose. But, what a difference in our country when it comes to the military and veterans, thank goodness. And this shows it in action where, the veterans on the left in, just a little more than 30 years ago, set it up to where the American soldier in 2004 could actually be named the Person of the Year. It just shows in action the way that that change has occurred. And this is just a little picture that I took as we were going through the site selection process. This is out of National Ronald Reagan Airport up in Washington, D.C. And it's just another display of the the attitude of the public toward veterans. So, okay, now moving on to the memorial. Well, I'm typically the guy who gets blamed for this because I had the bright idea. I just, it was right before the 20th anniversary of Desert Storm. And I came to the realization that all of the things that I just had talked about and reminded you, most people in this country really weren't thinking of, or they didn't remember that. And I even remember my own kids who were 10, 11 years old at the time, they really didn't know the story. And I came to the realization that Americans fell into one of three categories when it came to Operations Desert Shield and Storm. Either they had no recollection at all. Oh, that was that video game war where nobody died. It was over with before it started. Or they conflated it and confused it with the post 9/11 military actions, which had nothing to do with liberating Kuwait. And on top of that, we had 375 folks who made the ultimate sacrifice. And I personally felt like that sacrifice was just as important as any that had been made before or after Desert Storm. We couldn't forget that. Not to mention that there were almost 700,000 who deployed, whose service, should be recognized. So I get the idea. And then of course, the next step is, where do you put it? And really the only thing that made sense for me and our group of veterans who I assembled around me, I shared the vision and we had these dedicated folks who rallied around the cause. The only place it makes sense to tell this story is in Washington, D.C. You get 20 million visitors every year. And to tell something on that level, it has to be in Washington, D.C. So that whenever you do anything in Washington, D.C., you have to get congressional approval, everything. So started that process. And I wound up getting a really good partner in Congressman Phil Rowe, just recently retired, was a sponsor for this. We worked on the legislation. We introduced the legislation, and unfortunately it was late in the session. So we had to reintroduce it after the election and had to start all over from scratch. And I'll tell you, it was not a real high-tech operation. I was literally going to Washington, D.C., knocking on doors, going into offices, making phone calls. This was really, really low tech. But thank goodness, this all came to a head, and H.R. 503, the House version of this bill, was passed on May 28th of 2014. Took us a little over 2 years to do that, 2.5 years. By a 370-0 vote, and then S95, as you see on the screen, that was a Senate version. That was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act on December 19th of 2014. And this next picture will show you, this was just prior to the vote. I might have a little look of apprehension on my face because I wasn't sure. You never know what Congress is going to do until it's already, done and in the bag. But this was us with Congressman Rowe, some of the folks on the team, and some of the other interested parties. So that was a great day for us, and it was great to get to the point where we finally completed the legislation battle. Now we move on to the next step, which is location. And again, knew it had to be in Washington, D.C. Knew that you had to deal with a little bit of bureaucracy. If you're building it in Topeka, Kansas, it probably would have been built, 8 years ago. But they start you out in DC, and they essentially we had a list of 100 potential sites. We pretty much knocked a lot of those down to about 30 right off the bat. They just didn't fit right, weren't appropriate. We felt strongly that not only should this be visible, but it should be able to be visited, and it should be able to be accessed. And we didn't want to get into a scenario where it was kind of like a guy on a horse that people drive by and see and they point at. We wanted people to actually experience this. So as you see this map, it shows what's called the Area 2, Area 1, and the reserve, which is off limits. You can't do any building. And Skip will get into more of this detail, but we knew that we had to be somewhere that was fitting, that people would be able to actually go and visit and experience this memorial and not just look at it or not be able to, to get to it. So that was the start of this whole site selection. And I'm thinking to myself and our team, we're thinking, okay, well, how hard could this be? Okay, you go through a list of potential sites, you find out what is your preferred one, and then you get it, right? Well, wrong. It's supposed to take 18 months, and it ended up taking us 39 months to get the proper site. It was just a tremendous amount of work. But this shows you early on the site that we had identified during a site study was actually right next door to our actual site with a little circle in it. That's the actual site. Early on, a gentleman named Randy Schumacher, who is an architect, and also the architecture firm CSO Architects. They're based in Indianapolis, Indiana. They basically joined on, and I told them, somehow I got referred to this group, and I can't say enough about them, but I got referred to them through the American Institute of Architects in Washington. And they said, here's who you need to call. They didn't know me. I had no idea who they were. They said they're veteran friendly. And I told them what I was looking to do, what we were looking to do. And they should have hung up on me or said, hey, call back when you have legislation. I mean, they jumped in very, very early. I can't give them enough credit. But we got to work right away, and Randy worked on this. We got together a veteran survey because we didn't want this to be in a vacuum. We didn't want it just be 4 or 5 guys sitting around saying, hey, wouldn't it be neat if we did this or that? So we actually outreached to the veterans and the public at large and did this survey. And these are the 6 things that we boiled it down to that needed to be remembered. The significant and quick decisive victory, the coalition, of course, uniqueness of the desert environment, the MOP gear, which is down in the left corner there you'll see the chemical protective suit, the left hook maneuver, honor those who served and those who made the ultimate sacrifice. And our job is a little bit more difficult because as in Vietnam is a singular aspect. It's a place of mourning. I've got a cousin whose name is on that wall who was a navigator in Vietnam. It's not an uplifting experience. Ours had the trick of honoring those who served and those who passed away, while also remembering a very historic victory and a very uplifting message too, which Skip will get into. And of course, this is again is a left hook battle plan that shows that maneuver, which we drew inspiration, Randy drew inspiration from, as well as the desert environment. So there's some unique topography that's incorporated into this. And Randy actually got to work in 2012 and came up with this sketch, what they call the left hook design. Very, very unique. And his guiding principle has always been profound simplicity. We have a very profound message to tell, but we want to tell it in a clean, classy, and simplistic way. And this is just one of the early renderings that Randy put together in CSO. It was a watercolor that was professionally done that showed the original left hook. Now, Skip will get into the nuts and the bolts of the design evolution, but one of the things that people sometimes need to be reminded is that original left hook, people loved it. I've had the Kuwaiti ambassador tell me, "Oh my gosh, I love this," and I've had to assure them that this lives on in the new iteration and the new design, but we've had to work around this and incorporate it into a way that we're going to get approval for this. So I'm gonna be quiet. I'm going to turn it over to the expert in the room, Mr. Skip Graffam. Again, it's an honor to work with Skip. Skip, he'll never tell you this, but he is literally one of the top landscape architects in the country. He is a wonderful partner to work with, does outstanding work. And, it's nice to know that 50, 100 years from now, people are going to be going to Washington, D.C., and they're going to see Skip and Randy and everybody else's work live on. And that's what we're hoping, to tell this story for the ages. So without further ado, Skip, please take it over, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. I'm going to be blushing for a while with that grand introduction. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All set? Okay, great. So I think, as Scott mentioned, I just want to make sure I kick off by saying I'm a person on a very large team. So not only do I have team members in our office, but we are following up and continuing to collaborate with CSO architects. I know Tim's, I think, here in the crowd today, and also with our wonderful planning and advisor Alan Harwood, who was the one who worked with Scott through those 100 site selection efforts and guided us every step of the way. And our artist Robert Eccleston is here as well. So it's a very large team. I happen to be the one speaking this time, but the work you see is all of us. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. So what I'm going to do is the exact opposite of what actually happened. I'm going to go through this process quickly, which never happens in Washington D.C. But to give you a sense of what's went into this and where we are and what we still have to do. As Scott mentioned, we were given, several sites to look at. It was narrowed to 3 options. And the reason why this is important is obviously once this goes in the ground, it's never coming out, right? So the commissions that look after this, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, the National Capital Planning Commission, are very, very stringent because they're protecting a cultural resource. So the National Mall is, in their mind, a finished work of art. The reserve area is not meant to be touched. It's done in their mind, and they don't want to be adding additional things to it because it's really the nation's front yard. Everything happens there, and we don't want to turn it into a cemetery or a singular use. It's a very, very wide range of uses. And so we were given the Area 1 designation, and we happened to find the site at 23rd and Constitution, which is just outside the reserve. So we have the benefit of not needing to get in the reserve, which we couldn't, but yet we actually, from the perception point of view, we are in the reserve. And so how did we get there, and how did we arrive at that site? So the commission's asked us to look at 3 sites, and I'll go through these really quickly just to kind of show you the process. This was one site they asked us to look at, this kind of slightly sloping, ringed with cars, not really a great memorial, but we had to generate a number of design options for that site, which they studied. And we had to actually, we had to make it look like we really wanted the site to we had to study it in depth. And so they wanted us to really push the envelope. Another alternate site was called the Belvedere, which is down along the Potomac River. It's a very cool site. It used to be the terminus of Constitution Avenue, which has now been cut off by some of the, kind of banal traffic patterns that have developed over the years. It's a really interesting site, but right now it's terrible because it's cut off. And again, not a great memorial site. But again, we had to go through all the possible iterations and explore it in detail and essentially convince the commissions that these sites were not valid for us. Now, they might be great sites for others, but for the importance and the connectivity we wanted in the memorial to other things in Washington, this was not the right site for us. So the third site where we ended up is 23rd and Constitution. This is really the view. And as Scott said, it's all about the location here, the proximity to Lincoln, also the proximity to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, to the State Department, honoring the great diplomatic effort that was made and the effort to coordinate back channel communications with the United Nations and other countries. Those co-locations really mattered. As we heard the story of those who served in Desert Storm, many of the young officers who served in Vietnam became the more senior commanders in Desert Storm. And so not only is there a link in terms of changing the attitude, but there was actually a direct link by those serving in both conflicts. And so I think that co-location with Vietnam was incredibly important to the memorial. So the site, we got there, again, many, many iterations. What does it best look like? At the end of the day, we wanted to coexist with the rest of the National Mall. Some of the memorials are very large and sprawl over their immediate context. The idea was, how can this memorial fit gracefully into the larger landscape, but not dominate it, so that it essentially it takes over the area? And is there a way for other things to coexist? Like, can you walk and picnic in the green space that's between the memorial and the river? We didn't want to basically come in and hog the whole lawn panel, if you will. So it was very, very conscious to be a modest and connected memorial to the existing circulation. So we put in a very, very preliminary design for site selection. This is the commission. They are as grumpy and as serious as they look in the photo. And they do put you through the ringer. But again, the commission was established in the early 1900s to basically protect the implementation of the McMillan Plan, which is the plan of the kind of National Mall area of Washington, D.C. And they look at they also do a lot of other things as well, but that's one of their primary missions, is to essentially protect the cultural resources. And so you want them to be hard. You want them to work these designers hard to make sure the best solution is there, not only for the memorial, but to protect the larger landscape of the National Mall. So at the end of all of that, after we had thought we were going to be sent to the Belvedere, we came back and gave another presentation to them where we really emphasized why the Belvedere was not the right spot. And they came back and gave us this feedback that, a very elegant, low landscape-based solution that was respectful of the view sheds would work at 23rd and Constitution. So one of the things that we had talked about was, do we want to be somewhere else? We can be much larger and much more vertical and much more celebratory and much more, visible, if you will. And I think that working through this and talking with the board and the association and, Scott and his team, the location was most important. The kind of gravitas of being in that space right next to Lincoln was really, really important. And we will be on a loop that connects World War II, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Lincoln Memorial, Reflecting Pool, Korea. There's a very, very kind of regular tourist loop for visitors. Lincoln gets 7.5 million, Vietnam gets 6.5 million. We're basically right at the triangle between those two. That's a great location. Whereas we might have had our way with designing it somewhere else and done whatever we wanted, but we might not have had anywhere near, 10% of that traffic at another location. So I think the idea of celebrating that spot as a honoring those who served in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So here's the cast of characters on the site after having been given the site approval. And their smiles speak for themselves. I think we all felt great. So moving on now to concept design, I'll go through these really quickly. We're essentially where we are is we're continuing to develop the concept design, and some of it has been challenged by COVID in terms of being able to present in person versus remotely and so forth. So many things, have a challenge on the schedule. COVID was not necessarily super helpful in this regard. Overall, what you see is this has been very collaborative from the beginning. Here we are in CSO's office with Randy Schumacher there with the longer hair. We've worked also with our artists from the beginning as well. You can see we're doing virtual reality in the lower left and so forth. And throughout, there's been a lot of back and forth testing ideas and trying to see the same outcome from many different perspectives: planning, art, design, and so forth and so on. And here you see Robert, who's actually in the audience tonight, is our sculptor from Loveland, Colorado, and Jim Nance also, both sculptors. Robert's also a military veteran who probably smiled when Scott commented on the Army guys, huffing it in the desert. Good thing he's on mute. Here's Rob and Emily. Emily is our bas-relief artist too. So we have them all working together. Here you see some of the tools we're using. Robert constructed these really cool manipulatable eagle and falcons that he was testing where they might go and how that might be shown. Emily is working on a scale model in clay of the memorial wall. And so again, a lot of this active collaboration goes on. It's really effective when it's in person. So again, just to kind of walk you through the site and how that influences what we're doing. This was the original site. This used to be the Potomac River. It was filled up in about the late 1800s. And so the Lincoln Memorial was on created land. And so our site is that orange square. And you can see how Constitution Avenue used to terminate in the Belvedere. So we are occupying a very important piece. This is an interesting map that, again, shows kind of how the memorials are starting to lay out already. This is one that Alan did to talk about why this memorial should be where it is and how it represents essentially the kind of the end of the 20th century. It's right in line with those other ones, Korea, Vietnam, and World War II. And then how does this memorial serve not only as a memorial, but as an urban design piece in Washington? Constitution Avenue is one of the most important avenues. And these blue and white sites are existing memorials or monuments. And we wanted the commission to understand that the memorial should be part of this larger sequence of Washington, D.C., and be a destination in addition to being a memorial. Vietnam is very much about the honoring the loss of life of 50,000 plus Americans. Desert Storm is, while it is obviously honoring those who didn't come home, is very much a celebratory memorial in the sense of what was accomplished and the collaboration. And so we wanted to make a distinct difference between those. And so again, to have it be part of something you would come and sit in and just it'd be a wonderful place to be in addition to learning and understanding about Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So this is our site as we started to look at the size of the memorial, looking at the connectivity again from Lincoln and Vietnam and from State Department and so forth. We're very, very connected. This will be a really well visited memorial. We have to work with the National Mall landscape, the trees and so forth. These are historic trees that need to be preserved, and how is our memorial going to enhance those? We also have to look at flooding. We're just outside of the 100-year flood, but inside the 500-year flood. And so our memorial has to respond to that. Here you can see the white arrow is where the memorial will be from different angles of the site. And again, going back to our design inspiration as we were developing the concept, the dune landscape, the left hook, the idea of coalition, the power and speed of both the Desert Storms, but also the Desert Shield and Desert Storm operations themselves. The idea of creating an oasis in the center that is a wonderful place to be. As you know, DC can be incredibly hot. And then the idea of the celebration and homecoming and transformation. These, again, you can see these are like, this is probably not much is happening, but these are some significant changes. They're just really, really finely grained. And so we've evolved over time based on topography and visitor circulation and so forth to the lower right-hand scheme where we are today. And you can see the reserve, where we are in relation to it. We're right up against it. We were not allowed to build below that, south of that line, basically. So we're as close as we can get without violating that reserve line. Another unusual thing here is we also are part of the levee system. So interestingly, our memorial is about dune forms that create the kind of outside of the memorial, which also happens to be flood protection for part of Washington, D.C. So we were able to get more vertical by actually incorporating this levee, which exists all along the reflecting pool, which protects Washington from floods from the Potomac River. So that was another thing that needed to be incorporated and happened to work well with the dune forms. So again, trying to, use that to our advantage to maybe get away with a little more height than we would. And then of course the idea of the dunes, understanding how they're structured and so forth. So this is kind of an overall aerial view of the memorial, and you can see those two landforms, which are sand dunes. Basically, they're shaped like them. They follow that kind of form, and they're slid slightly apart to have a larger opening on one side and a smaller one on the inner to kind of give the idea of entrance and exit. The form spirals up to a central point, and then there's views outside, which are very important. So again, we were required to stay low, and so that put a lot of constraints on what we can do. Honoring those thematic elements that Scott had mentioned, celebrating the service and sacrifice of the operation, the transformation or the pivot in understanding between the public and the military and the coalition. These were the three main themes and how they're laid out. So we have this ascending walk up. Again, it's that kind of celebratory moment where you're coming up to the high point in the center of the memorial, in contrast to the sequence that you see at Vietnam. Again, the idea of an oasis, we want it to be comfortable, the idea of having water in the center and trees to really allow people to come and enjoy it. If you go to the World War II Memorial in the summer, you're not staying there more than 10 minutes. It's a tough experience. So we want people to come and sit and be there as a space, as a destination. So again, we'll go through these really quickly. This is the memorial and plan view. It's pretty good size. It's not huge, but it's the size, say, for example, if you've been in the Korean Memorial, it's the size of that circular area with the fountain and the trees. It's also the same size as the Navy Memorial in downtown Washington. So it's a good size for even hosting events. But it's not so big that it's sprawling all over the National Mall, which would not have gotten us the site. Let's put it that way. The dune forms, we've already started to do the topography. This is a section through that. You can see kind of the two walls are created by the dunes, and that allows our commemorative work to be shown there. Here you can see it. It is it's mostly a kind of a space for personal reflection and enjoyment, but it can host an event related to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and honoring the anniversary or something. So we are allowing for gatherings, but it's not the main driver. And so here you can see some of the views from the north looking in. It's open to maintain views of Lincoln. At the same time, there is some protection at the corner from traffic noise. The dune form again helps us with that. And then the view looking to the north from kind of the Lincoln sidewalk, again, opening views with the commemoration on the walls, with the fountain and space in the center. We're also looking at, quotes. So we're still in the process of ironing out the thematic elements and looking at how we might kind of bring these elements to life on the walls. We've looked at a variety of kind of collages for a large bas-relief on the walls and how that might work, how those are then carved in a bas-relief format that works. We also are looking at, the idea of representing the leadership of the United States and the liberation of Kuwait as more abstracted forms like the eagle and the falcon, the national birds. And can those play a role on the wall and celebrate that leadership of the United States and the liberation of Kuwait? And so those are, tying in with the dune forms in a way that gives a geographical context, but also is really powerful and uplifting in the message. And so these are just, again, sketches to show how this might work, and some early clay sketches from Emily about how this might work. And then you can kind of see here an idea. This is very much in progress, but the idea of this wall as something you evolve and walk along a left hook pattern, left hook movement, and the cinematic bas-relief is revealed as you walk along. Same thing on the smaller wall, the idea of transformation and homecoming. And again, we're looking at, is there bas-relief, is there sculpture, is there quotes, and so forth. So these are, again, these thematic elements are being fine-tuned. And then finally in the center, the coalition as the center point, because it was such a unique element and everything really revolved around that diplomatic and then later military element, the coalition is placed kind of in the center as the high point. And the idea of creating a water element, but also the idea of a shield, the fact that all the countries took up the shield and it represents that kind of protection of Kuwait, the liberation of Kuwait, and the idea of having water interact in different ways. Again, it could be a fountain with the coalition names around it that's very much helps reduce traffic noise, creates that kind of comfortable cooling feel in the center. But it might have different states of water. If it's turned off, it could be very, very reflective. As it dries out, a pattern and elements of the shield will be revealed. It's important to design a fountain to be off as much as it is on, because in Washington and with the Park Service maintaining things, things are often off, let's put it that way. So you better be prepared that that's your main state. And then again, you can see we're looking at ways to celebrate and represent all the different countries that participated. And then here you can kind of see some of the shots of how the different spaces might work together. The memorial it does rise up, but it's 100% accessible for wheelchairs and everybody throughout. There's places to sit so you can stay. And again, it's meant to be a moment along Constitution Avenue that's a significant space that one is welcome to come and join again. So this is, again, importance about our role on the mall. And this is where we are in the concept design process and hoping to go back to the commission to get final approval, and then we'll go into construction. So I think that's it. Hope that maybe push the time a bit, but that's where we're wrapped up. So Annette and Jacqueline, I think I'll turn it back to you.
No, that's great. Thank you both, Scott and Skip, for that wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot from that. I think now is the time to open it up for questions for either of you. So please put those in the chat if you have some. Just to get us kickstarted here, I do have probably the main question that's on everybody's mind is, when do you expect to break ground?
2 years ago. No, Skip had mentioned that COVID has created a little bit of, some unforeseen obstacles, and I think it's impacted all of us, sure, with our timeline and so forth. But we still would like to have the groundbreaking sometime in 2021 to mark that 30th anniversary. And obviously, at this point, what we're looking for is probably sometime in the third or fourth quarter at the earliest. A lot of it's going to be dependent upon getting the commission approval with the final design, which Skip and Randy and the entire team are still plugging away on.
Great. And with that in mind, I guess a follow-up question would be, how many annual visitors are you guys expecting with all of the surrounding memorials?
Well, Scott, maybe I'll start. I know it's interesting. Kyle Leggs and I attended a presentation at the Honor Flight group when they were at one of the conferences we attended, and they were very, very interested in learning about the memorial's placement, and they were already like, well, this is going to be an easy add to our loop. And so I think not only for veterans who are coming through something like that, but just we've looked at the visitor flow along Constitution Avenue from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I could see this easily having anywhere from 4 to 6 million visitors a year because of, like I said, Lincoln is 8 million and Vietnam is probably 6.5 to 7 annually. And we are 2 minutes away from both of them. And we are a logical step to between the two. And we're a nice shady walk. So if you can see here, here's Lincoln, here's Vietnam. And so if they're walking on Constitution, they're either going to come by here or go this way to come back. And the metro is up here. So the closest metro stop is up here. So we are right on the route. And this is the loop that comes. Here's World War II coming up. Here's Vietnam, Desert Storm, Lincoln, the reflecting pool. Korea's down here. So this loop here around with the centered on the reflecting pool is really, really busy. And usually if people can only come for a day, they usually do this area. The monument, Washington Monument, is basically right here too. So that's the other kind of bookend to Lincoln. So between these two, you could probably do all of that in a couple of hours if you really were feeling energetic.
Great. Another big question that's probably on everyone's mind coming from our president and CEO, Mike Carr. He's asking, what about funding? Where does all of the money come from to support this effort?
That's a great question, Mike. And, from the very beginning, we felt that it was important, no matter what our country's financial situation is, we just wanted to not encumber the taxpayer in any way, shape, or form. So this is 100% private monies, period. We're not taking any taxpayer funding for this. And that's one of the other pieces that we're working on diligently to get wrapped up. We have to have the rest of the funding in place along with the design approval before we can break ground. And we're still identifying and securing 20 million that we have left. We have some talks that are way down the road on that. So it's I hope it's not as big of a hill as it sounds like, but I don't think it will. But so that's where we are with the funding. So as soon as we get that final tranche of the 20 million, whether it comes from 1, 2, or 10 different places, then we're done. We're essentially halfway at this point with the funding.
That's great. We have another question from the audience. Once you guys get all of your final approvals, how long do you expect the construction phase to take?
Well, I think the nice thing is this is a fairly, it doesn't sound simple to this point, but the actual construction, given that we're out of the floodplain, given that we're fairly small, I think this is probably anywhere from 9 to 12 months, depending. It's really, we understand the site. We've already done some geotechnical borings. We understand where the utilities are. There's a lot of prep work. We also do have our engineers already work. We have them on the team. We've done other work. So while we're waiting for approvals, we're also concurrently kind of developing the actual documentation that will lead. So we won't have much downtime between approval and the kind of the start of construction because we've done a lot of the legwork to begin with. But I would say less than a year for sure. I don't see this as an issue. The main thing will be the stone. And so that will be, that's really the first item, is to get that and secure that. The actual construction is not that challenging. It's essentially, the 2 dune walls and the paving, and the artistic pieces are probably our longest lead items, to be sure. And Rob is probably going, yes, at least, since he's going to be the one having to carve it.
Follow-up question to that, what stone is going to be used for the construction?
Well, right now we're assuming a granite. There's some quartzite options, but the challenge is that, if in the US, sand colored granite is one of the hardest things to find. So we're going to have to go outside the country, most likely. That's our goal, is to try and recreate that sand color. And so there are options in Brazil. There's some options in Eastern Europe. We have identified those that I think that will be workable, but granite is, for the Park Service, is the preferred option, just given the durability. Even though this is being funded by, Scott and the board, this is on Park Service property. So we are essentially turning over the memorial to them to maintain, and they have certain requests that are polite at first and then become more stringent as you go along, because they need to maintain it. And even though the memorial will fund some of the maintenance going forward, they have to feel comfortable that they're not inheriting a nightmare of maintenance problems. So the granite is as much a material choice for us aesthetically as it is for the Park Service for longevity and durability, because this is this is forever. This is not going anywhere. So we need to make sure it has the best chance of maintaining its appearance as long as possible.
Well, with the maintenance of that, I guess a next follow-up question is going to be, who is responsible for maintaining the memorial?
Right. The Park Service is ultimately responsible, as it is their property. There are arrangements like at Korea where there is almost a friends of group that does provide funding, that the Park Service has a memorandum of agreement with. And I think, Scott, we've talked about that. I think that, the Park Service will maintain it and do their best, but the Park Service doesn't always, they have to oversee everything here in the National Mall. And so having a support group that helps them and is dedicated funding is really important, I think. And I think that's a model that is helpful. And again, we're not a giant memorial, so we don't have, it's a more modest maintenance budget will be needed, but supplementing the Park Service, I think, is a great way to make sure that it looks exactly how you want it to look, rather than how they are able to keep it up, which is, can vary depending on their budget situation.
And just one final question, I don't see any more in the chat. On a personal note, what is your personal goals or desires for the average visitor to the memorial?
Skip, we can both pipe in on that real quick. Mine has always been from the very beginning is to make sure that they learn this story, that it's not forgotten, that all who were involved are not forgotten, because it really is a remarkable point in history. And, the thing that I've learned, they kept telling us during these commission meetings, it can't be a museum. You can't put all of that information out there. You can't throw it all out there. But I hope that the average visitor would come and be inspired to learn more and look up about this amazing time in history.
Yeah, and I think same thing for me. I think as a designer, I feel most rewarded when people kind of don't think about me and think about what it is you've created and the story that's behind it. So I think that being part of this is an incredible honor for me and everyone that works on this. And just knowing that the men and women that participated in Desert Shield and Desert Storm are represented in the appropriate way to honor their service is, for me, it makes it most satisfying for me. And it's also a place that you would come just to be in as a great space. Again, some of these memorials are not really designed with people in mind. They're designed with the, kind of the look. And so this is meant to be a memorial that you would come to and be comfortable staying in and enjoying as an urban space in Washington, not just, baking in the sun of, a very, very formal space. It's meant to be both inspiring, honorific, as well as enjoyable and welcoming. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Skip, if you don't mind, just to stop sharing your
Sure.
screen now,
Uh-huh.
we'll switch back over to our side. I want to thank everyone for their time this afternoon to join us for our first virtual Mojo event. Just a few quick reminders, if you're not already, to follow us online. We have lots of great content that we continually push out to all of our fans and followers. Special today, we have some of our newest partners, the Old Salt Coffee Company. It's comprised of veterans themselves who are offering a special discount to all of our participants today on any of their coffee. I'm drinking some Haze Gray right now. And you can use Mojo 10 at checkout at oldsaltcoffee.com to get your 10% off your entire purchase. And then following this, we will be sending out a short survey to all of our participants, and we invite you to join us for the event, which will be on May 11th. It's actually going to be a roundtable discussion with producer Tim Gray and USS Missouri crew member and eyewitness to the surrender ceremony 75 years ago, Don Fosberg. And we will be sharing a premiere link to view this new documentary that will be released later in May to all of our participants in advance. So you'll get a special screening of that and a chance to talk story with both the producer and one of the eyewitnesses himself. So we invite you to join us for that. We are offering a discount code for all of you that participate with us today to enjoy that. So look out for the survey in your email and information on our next event. And with that, we thank you all for joining us virtually today from around the country, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks a lot. And Skip, thank you very much for joining us and helping us today. Appreciate it. Stay in touch.
Thank you. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.
It's been a while.
Thanks so much.